Good afternoon. Oh, now you can hear me. You have to fight the temptation to say Shabbat Shalom because I don't see crowds like this all the time. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Rabbi Sharon Mars from Columbus, Ohio. And thank you. I am excited to spend this next hour together hearing from three inspiring individuals about their work on racial justice, criminal justice, reform, and voting rights, all of which are intimately connected. Three distinct, internationally respected voices are here with us today. Piper Kerman, Reverend Cornell William Brooks, and Michael Waldman all join us today. It's a huge privilege for me to be here with them on this stage. And they will offer their unique perspectives on how to work towards racial justice and how we engage in all of our communities in these efforts as well. In my own community, I have seen up close the power of what civil rights attorney Brian Stevenson has called getting proximate. You've heard this a lot of times this conference. But over the past couple of years, for me, I've started taking congregants of my synagogue, Temple Israel Columbus, to Marion Correctional Institution, about an hour north of Columbus, on what you might call soul field trips. And those soul field trips are when we regularly go to hear the men of Marion who host TEDx talks put on by the men of Healing Broken Circles, a program focused on engaging with the incarcerated individuals of Marion through strength-based training and trauma-responsive education. Picture a room of teenage, mutant religious students and their parents and empty nesters and sometimes rabbis from Reform, Ohio, who are here today, have come with us also. Picture us in a room together with the men of prison, the men taking to the TEDx stage, usually happens in the prison chapel, and then they take us through spoken word and dance and rap and even Shakespeare, and then everyone sitting knee to knee as the Torah scroll, which we've brought with us, is unraveled and brought across everyone's laps. And we ask them, Ayeka, Ayeka, the ancient words from Genesis, that call that the Holy One asked the first human being in the Garden of Eden, Ayeka, where are you? Where are you in this story, which is the Jewish narrative, but also the very human narrative of being created and being enslaved and being liberated and being consecrated? Can you find yourself in this holy place? And through our conversation, by getting proximate, to hear people who live inside, talking with people who live outside, answer together, Hineni, Hineni, I think I'm right here. Here I am. I can find myself in this story of struggle and suffering, and I feel strengthened because we are sharing it together. This afternoon, we're going to hear from each of these speakers individually, and then we're going to engage in a broader conversation. The full biographies of each panelist is available to you in your program booklet. So I am thrilled to be here with Piper Kerman, who is activist and author of the best-selling book, Orange is the New Black, My Year in a Women's Prison. Michael Waldman, president of the Brennan Center for Justice at the NYU School of Law, and former chief speechwriter for President Bill Clinton, and Reverend Cornell William Brooks, the president of the NAACP. Piper Kerman. We'll hear briefly from each panelist in turn, and then we're going to move to a conversation followed by your questions and answers. So first, Piper Kerman. She once said, "I hoped that after reading my book, someone might come away with a different idea about who is in prison in this country." I think that is most certainly the case, as this book plus the Netflix series based on it has helped change the national conversation on prison reform. Please welcome our first speaker, Piper Kerman.
Thank you, Rabbi Mars. I am also a resident of Columbus, Ohio. And boy, when I got to Columbus and I got to meet Rabbi Mars, I was so thrilled. It made me feel like moving from Brooklyn was not a mistake. I want to thank you all, first of all, for being here and for being with us. And I want to thank you for prioritizing criminal justice reform and recognizing its crucial role in social justice in this country. I want to thank you for giving me something that my mother-in-law is going to be able to brag about to her Brandeis group. That means a lot to me. When my book was published in 2010, and one of the first things I did post-publication was to visit the Brandeis group who had read the book, I will tell you something, that those ladies asked me more questions than the U.S. attorney. So, I was sent to prison in 2004 for a 10-year-old drug offense, first time nonviolent offense. Most of the women that I was incarcerated with had little to none of my advantages. Things like a safe and stable home to grow up in, a college education that no strip search could take away from me, many years of work in sort of the mainstream, legitimate economy, something that would be important later in my life. Most of the women that I did time with had none of those advantages, not at all. They came from the poorest communities. They came from the most fragile families. The women that I met during that year of incarceration schooled me, and in some cases they befriended me, and they helped me survive that experience, and they shared their own survival with me, and I am profoundly grateful to them. Many of those women who extended the hand of friendship to me, their own lives had been devastated by addiction and substance abuse. Some of them had lost parents. In some cases, their health had been harmed, and their own health or their relationship with their children had been frayed by all of the harms that come along with addiction. And it was my relationship with those women, it was my connection with them that helped me to truly comprehend the harm of my own actions. It was not the cage that we shared, right? I think that connection is so important. When we allow ourselves to be truly connected to other people, when we repudiate divisions, when we repudiate status and hierarchy, that is when inequality becomes intolerable, even for people who have had many advantages which perhaps they took for granted, like I did, right? Certainly that's how I felt when I exited prison, that the inequalities which were on such display in the criminal justice system, and which were so stark in those intimate relationships that I had forged with the women I did time with, those inequalities were intolerable to me, right? Prisons and jails are, in this country, one of our ultimate tools of marginalization, right? That's actually what prisons and jails are intended to do. Someone commits a crime, they do something we don't like, they do something that harms another person or harms the community, and we say to them, we don't like what you've done, we're gonna put you aside in a prison, in a jail, for whatever the term of your sentence is, and then maybe we'll allow you to return to the community, though in fact we create many, many post-prison barriers to ever returning safely to the community. So again, that's exactly what a prison or jail is intended to do. it would be my observation, after doing time, after visiting many, many jails, county and city jails, state prisons, federal prisons, all kinds of carceral institutions in this country, and after spending more than 2 years teaching in the prison that Sharon mentioned and also in the primary women's prison in Ohio, it would be my observation that the people who fill up those prisons and jails had experienced marginalization long before they ever walked through prison gates, right? And there are so many ways that we push people to the edge or outside of the community, right? It can be racism that we use to marginalize people. It can be homophobia, mental illness, substance abuse, all kinds of different ways that we choose to exclude people in the community. And it would be my other observation that when we choose to pull people closer to the heart of the community instead, when we have a problem like mental illness or substance use disorder or a host of other things, that's when we're going to be less reliant on prisons and on jails. So when we look at the criminal justice system, we sort of have this expectation that every American will be treated equally in our courts, but we know the data shows us very clearly that that's not true. As an example, we know that African American people are at least 4 times more likely to be arrested for simple possession of marijuana than white people in this country, and in many places, actually, the disparity is much greater. I know I don't need to point out to anyone that white people smoke just as much marijuana as everyone else. The data shows that very clearly. The criminal justice system, however, is a crucible of inequality in this country, and that's one of the reasons that I think so many people have now begun to focus and pay attention, and that has been a priority in this gathering for more, since certainly the last convocation. I was so thrilled to hear that Brian Stevenson spoke to you all 2 years ago. I always say that the most unusual thing about my own story is not the fact that I committed a crime. It is the fact that I was policed, that I was prosecuted, and that I was punished with prison. Because those are things that we overwhelmingly reserve for poor people in this country and disproportionately for poor people of color. So lots of room for improvement, right? The good news is that we have the Constitution on our side. I'll leave that to Michael to discuss further. But what do we need to do? What do we need to do to get to work? The challenge, I think, for Reform Judaism community particularly is choosing strategic and authentic actions and really thinking about what's most appropriate in the place where you do your work. I would suggest thinking about it this way, perhaps. Choose those actions that can bring your community proximate with those most unfairly and significantly impacted by mass incarceration, whether that's incarcerated people or whether that's communities and most specifically families and children who are affected by incarceration. That's really important to get proximate. That will give the connection and the authenticity to the action, further actions that you might choose. But it's also really important strategy-wise for, I think, the Reform Judaism community to leverage your influence and your moral authority to insist that the existing power structure, and I'm talking about elected officials, I'm talking about judges, I'm talking most of all about prosecutors, to insist that those people who currently hold so much power in this country over other people's lives, to insist that they do things differently. This is those two things, that sort of bringing yourself closer to the people most affected and using your power, your influence, and your moral authority to ask already powerful people to do things differently. That is the thing that I think is most welcome, things that so many people in this room are already doing, and the thing that will really create change in this country. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Piper. Michael Waldman is author of The Fight to Vote, and has noted, when it comes to voting rights, instead of quiet, we should expect storms. And we should require that presidents and the justices they nominate stand strong for democracy. Please help me welcome Michael Waldman.
Thank you, Rabbi, and thank you to all of you. It is truly wonderful to be here among other things with so many neighbors from Congregation Beth Elohim in Brooklyn, in the house where my 3 children became B'nai Mitzvot. You heard that I, once upon a time, was a presidential speechwriter, and I always like to point out that the very first speech I ever wrote was my bar mitzvah speech. It was also the most lucrative and gave me an entirely misleading understanding of the economics of the profession. But it is wonderful to be with all of you, to be here in a community of people of conscience, a community rooted in the values not only of Judaism, not only of Reform Judaism, but of our country. In so many ways, the values of Reform Judaism reflect and are echoed by what we believe America is when it is at its best. The values of equality, of commitment to justice, of tolerance, of respect for human dignity, for the worth of every individual. When America is at its best, that is what it stands for. And so we, all of us, have a lot of work to do now and always to bring those values to the country. I've been very, very lucky. I have the chance to try to live out those values at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. We are a nonpartisan law and policy institute devoted, as we see it, to reforming and revitalizing the systems of democracy and justice in America. We work on criminal justice, we work on racial justice, we work especially on the systems of democracy, which are always in need of repair and at this moment are stretched tight. We are focused on those systems because the way we see it is if you want to solve the problems, you've got to fix the systems. That's more true now, I would suggest, than almost ever before. And the Brennan Center was started 20 years ago as a living memorial to the late, great Supreme Court Justice William Brennan, Jr., the great liberal justice on the Supreme Court. And this was his vision of the Constitution, which is really interesting in the sense that it reflects some of our approach to faith and our approach to the long traditions of Judaism. This is what Justice Brennan said. He said, "The genius of the Constitution rests not in any static meaning that it might have had in a world that is dead and gone, but in the adaptability of its great principles to cope with current problems and current needs." We Americans have an unusual way of doing social justice and reform. It's not the way they do it in other countries. We honor those values. We look at the documents like the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. They've been described as a kind of a civic religion. And we looked backwards to them for those ideals, and we hold up today's institutions in the light of those timeless ideals. And when those institutions are found wanting, we all work to change them. We test the institutions of our time by timeless values. And we know that that approach is needed right now in fundamental ways. Now, there's a lot going on in our communities. We're all part of it. And I'm going to focus considerably in what I have to say about what's happening right here in Washington across the river. Because as mesmerizing as it can be, and as transfixing as it can be, it is far more than a reality show. It affects all of our communities. The voices we hear, the echoes we hear reverberate in all the work we do everywhere. Now, you know, this isn't the first time we faced challenges in the country's history. We've had racial division from the beginning. We've had demographic change before. We've had changes of administration before. Some I like, some I don't like. All of us have lived through this before. And the founders knew this. They were worried about times just like this. James Madison actually said in his notes at the Constitutional Convention that they were worried that in the future the voters of this country would become, as he put it, he actually said this, tools of, quote, a man of opulence and ambition, if we weren't careful. We've had these kinds of challenges before, but every one of us knows as well that in some basic ways this is different. This is unlike anything we as a country have faced in decades, if ever. We have not had a president in decades, if ever, so eager to smash through the unwritten norms of our constitutional system, the written and unwritten laws by which our democracy governs itself. We have not had in decades a president who places in a position of high trust an overt white nationalist, who gives an inaugural address that leaves out a mention of the Constitution, that does not use the word liberty, that does not mention the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. You have to go back a long way, if ever, to find that. We all know the ways in which this is a potentially different and dangerous time. We also know that we've never seen a reaction like this. We've never seen a response like this. We never saw 5 million people on the streets the day after the inaugural. We have more rulings, 8 federal judges, more rulings striking down the actions of the new administration than major laws passed in the new administration. And I am telling you with every bone in my body that would not have happened but for those 5 million people on the streets. We, the people, decide what the Constitution is, and we sometimes do it with our feet, and that gave momentum and courage to people in government, to people in politics, and yes, to people in the courts. And we need to constantly be backing up those judges who are under increasing and unprecedented assault. Their job is to read the law and the Constitution, and our job is to back them up when they do it. Now, there are many great fights underway for American democracy. I want to mention 2 of them. The first, as you heard, is something on which I work very directly, the right to vote and the endless fight to vote. And this is something that's been going on, again, since the beginning of the country. In 1776, the fight at the time was whether there would be a property requirement. Only, at that moment, only white men who owned property were allowed to vote. Ben Franklin led the fight against that. This is true. He said that when he wrote the Pennsylvania Constitution, he said, there's a man who owns a jackass, and it's worth $50, so the man can vote. Then the jackass dies. The man is wiser, he's more knowledgeable about government, but the jackass is still dead. So Franklin asked, who really has the right to vote? The man or the jackass? It's pretty smart. Well, one more reason to love Ben Franklin. John Adams represented a different view. The many times when people in power fought to restrict democracy and to keep new voices from being heard. He was urged to end this property requirement up in Massachusetts, and he said this. He was aghast. He said, if we do that, women will demand the right to vote. Lads of 18 will think themselves insufficiently attended to. They will demand a right to vote. Men without a farthing to their name will think themselves worthy of an equal voice in government, and they will demand a right to vote. And Adams said, there will be no end of it. And that is basically the history of our country. As we fought and fought to widen the circle of democracy, most profoundly, most significantly, in the glorious victory of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which, for the first time, won with the blood and courage of thousands of ordinary Americans in Selma and everywhere else, for the first time, truly guaranteed a right to vote, regardless of race, regardless of ethnicity. Now, as you all know, that is not in the history books anymore. That is constantly and currently under attack. There has been a wave of laws across the country making it harder for people to vote for the first time since the Jim Crow era. We've been successful working, among other things, with the NAACP and other civil rights groups in beating many of these efforts back. The Supreme Court took an important step in the wrong direction. In the Shelby County case in 2013, it gutted that Voting Rights Act. Chief Justice Roberts, he said basically, well, that was then, this is now, it's not needed anymore. Look at black voter participation rates in the South. We don't need it anymore. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote a very famous dissent. She said, that's like standing in a rainstorm, holding an umbrella and not getting wet, and deciding, therefore, you don't need an umbrella anymore. What happened? 2 hours later, the state of Texas implemented its voter ID law, the harshest in the country. That's the law, you may have heard of it, where you cannot use your University of Texas ID to vote, but you can use your concealed carry gun permit. 608,000 people were instantly disenfranchised. Representing the NAACP and other groups, we went to court. We met a woman named Sammy Louise Bates. She remembered growing up in Mississippi, counting out the money for her grandmother to pay the poll tax. She moved to Detroit and Chicago. It's kind of the great American story. She went to college. She then actually retired in Texas. She lives on Social Security and nothing else. And she lost the right to vote. She'd been voting since she was 21. She lost the right to vote. And we asked her, well, why don't you just get a birth certificate, get the copy of your birth certificate from Mississippi? And she said, well, that costs $43. I have to put that money where it will do the most good. You can't eat a birth certificate. She was the lead witness in a trial, and that trial found that this law was discriminatory, illegal, unconstitutional, and it has been struck down over and over again. But there's one problem. The federal government has switched sides. We all know that the new president, as soon as he won, as soon as he took office, began tweeting that there were 3 to 5 million illegal voters in the United States, as nonsensical a claim as it was possible to have, even more than the idea that the mall was full on Inauguration Day. As though there were millions of people voting not 50 years ago, 6 months ago, and nobody noticed, illegal voters. That was kind of garish. In this last hearing on the Texas case, the day before the hearing, the Justice Department, which had been in this case from the beginning, announced that it was pulling out. And the private groups had to argue, and still won. But it is a terrible omen of what the Jeff Sessions Justice Department is going to mean for all of us. So that is a fight that is going to go on and on in states and cities around the country that we all are going to have to do much more to be part of. The other great debate that you are so engaged in, that I'll be quick on because you'll hear from others, is the fight for criminal justice reform. What else tests our values as a country more than this? What else tests our values as Jews more than this? You know the statistics. They are as sobering as can be. We have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prison population. People behind bars, the number of people behind bars has gone up 400%, and 500% in the last 40 years, and it is not necessary to promote and protect public safety. You've heard the president in his inaugural address claim that there is American carnage, that we are living through a crime wave of terrifying proportions. Nonsense. Crime is at the lowest level in decades, and anybody who walks down the street in America knows that. You are going to be doing an important thing, going to the Hill to lobby for an important piece of criminal justice legislation. And as you know, the overwhelming problem and the overwhelming solution to the criminal justice system is in the states and in the cities. But the national government has an important role to play. A lot of the bad policies were incentivized by Washington through dollars and through other things. There's a wonderful, encouraging, heartening, truly cross-ideological bipartisan movement for criminal justice reform that we're all part of. It includes the ACLU, it includes the NAACP, it includes the Koch brothers and the Heritage Foundation. And the legislation introduced by Senator Grassley and Lee and Cornyn, backed by Speaker Ryan, as well as by Senators Booker and Durbin, really would make a good start at federal sentencing reform. If it had gone to the floor in the Senate last year, it would have gotten about 85 votes. One U.S. senator stood up behind closed doors and killed it. Do you know who that was? Jeff Sessions. Out of 100 senators, he literally was the worst one in the whole Senate. He, in case we're wondering what direction we believe that the Justice Department may be heading at the current moment, his top aide on criminal justice reform is a person named Stephen Cook. He was the head of the line prosecutors union, basically. And this is what he told the Washington Post. He said, the federal criminal justice system, last week, simply is not broken. In fact, it's working exactly as designed. Some might say that's true, but that's the problem. We're in a major fight here, and this is something where public opinion is with us, where bipartisan momentum is with us, and all of you can make a huge difference in keeping that momentum going. There's so much you can do. What you're going to be doing here in Washington is part of it. What you can do in communities is part of it. Being active on social media is incredibly critical. I don't know if you know this. I didn't know this. Conservative voices are far more active on social media than progressive voices. Not just Russian bots or Estonian teenagers hired to write articles, but just a willingness to speak up. There are campaigns to support. There are ballot initiatives to support. There's going to be a ballot initiative, we think, at some point in the next couple of years in Florida to end felony disenfranchisement there once and for all. That's something people can do something about. And everyone here can consider not only supporting people who run for office, but running for office. We've had 2 people from the Brennan Center, actually one of them quit their job to go move to another state to run for office. This is one of those break-point moments in the country's history. Every one of us will have to remember, what did we do right now when our time was testing, when our values were tested, as they have not been in years? I have no doubt that this group, that all of you in this room are ready to go and ready to meet that test. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Michael. Reverend Cornell William Brooks has continuously preached that each of us use our own prophetic voices in the ongoing fight for freedom and justice in our country. He himself is one of the seminal prophetic voices of our time. Please welcome Reverend Brooks.
Good afternoon. It is such a humbling honor to be in the presence of so many friends and colleagues and sojourners on this walk for justice. This consultation on conscience occurs at a peculiar moment in history where not only secularists but skeptics might question the moral propriety and the political efficacy of a group of rabbis and people of faith gathering, thinking that they can have some impact on what is happening in Washington and across the length and breadth of our republic. But those who question the political efficacy of this gathering, the moral import of this gathering, are not aware of the impact, the history of the reform movement. They're certainly not aware of the impact, the moral standing of the NAACP. They're certainly not aware of the power of the people in this room committed to the cause of justice unapologetically. So we find ourselves at this anguishing hour of history, faced with at least two challenges that prick the conscience and disturb the soul. Those being criminal justice reform and voting rights reform. We're all well aware that we stand before an ugly architecture of exclusion called the criminal justice system. We are aware of the tragic statistics of 2.2 million Americans behind bars. America representing 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's prisoners. We're all well aware of the fact that 40% of our young white men will be arrested. 50% of our African American men. We're all aware of the fact that 70 million Americans have a criminal record. It disturbs us. It unsettles us. It does something to the soul of our country, to the soul of the reform movement, to the soul of those of us who call ourselves Christians. But I need to be clear that we will not adopt a supine position of subservience before this system. In fact, if you check the record, we are indeed making progress. May I remind you, in the state of New Jersey, where I spent a little time before coming to the NAACP, we partnered with the Jewish Federation, we partnered with Reform rabbis, and when we confronted the problem of recidivism, that is to say that revolving door of people going in and out of prison, we passed a comprehensive prisoner reentry package of bills that the New York Times called a model for the country. We did it with people of faith. We did it with fiscal conservatives. We did it with people who believe, and we did it in spite of the odds and despite of the political forces arrayed against us. We stormed the legislature. We made the case on social media. We reached out to students at Princeton and at Rutgers, and we made the case day in and day out, and we won. We were aware of the empirical and experiential reality that so many of our young people revolve in and out of prison, day in and day out. We understand that, in the words of one Supreme Court justice, that when you have a criminal record, it represents a lifetime. That is an eternal ban on employment. But what we did in New Jersey with a tight, disciplined policy and economic message was we made the case to fiscal conservatives. We made the case to moral progressives and moderate progressives, to Jews and Gentiles, Catholics and Protestants, labor folks, civil rights folks, that the criminal justice challenges before us are not about the black and brown they, but the multicolored, multi-ethnic, multiracial us. Let me give you an example. When we tried to build support for a ban the box law, that is to say, understanding that 70 million Americans have a criminal record, and then when they face an employment application and a millimeter wide and high box that asks the seemingly innocuous question, have you ever been arrested or convicted of a crime? And the answer to that box results almost always in not getting an interview, not getting a call back, not having the opportunity for employment. That is to say, not only increasing your net worth, but your self-worth. And we brought together the New Jersey State Conference of the NAACP, the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, brought together a group of rabbis, a group of priests, a group of ministers, and we asked them to talk among one another, teach among one another, whether the biblical precepts around second chances, whether the biblical precepts that speak to the redemption of our humanity. And as a consequence of rabbis talking to one another, ministers talking to one another, priests talking to one another, they didn't engage in lobbying. This was not a political effort. This was a moral effort. And again, we won. Now, let's be clear about this. The rabbis were not engaged in some wild moral venture. The advocacy, the prophetic ministry, if you will, was based upon solid social science. There's something called the Nakamura study, the Nakamura-Bloomstein study, that says that essentially after 7 years, after a person has been convicted of a crime, served their sentence, and after 7 years, they're no more likely to commit a crime than anyone else. This bit of social science is called literally the redemption study. So here we have an instance where the social science backs up the biblical wisdom, in which case the rabbis, the priests, and the ministers were right. But we have, as was mentioned, an attorney general. You may have heard via Twitter or cable news, the NAACP has had a little run-in with our attorney general. And in fact, we went to visit his office in Mobile, Alabama. And we got into a little trouble around civil disobedience, and yours truly, along with several of my colleagues, we were arrested. But let us note this. The reason we were arrested was because we were trying to stop this attorney general from turning back the clock on criminal justice reform. We have red state governors and blue state governors who understand profoundly that it's not working. We are literally wasting, burning tax dollars in service of a system that does not serve our ends as a just society. And so we opposed his nomination. We testified against him. And when he reached out to us and asked us to come visit him, we reminded him, Attorney General Sessions, most governors agree with us. Red state governors, blue state governors believe that we have to have a criminal justice system that redeems people, ensures that they are responsible workers and responsible citizens. So what are we doing across the country beyond civil disobedience? Down in Florida, we looked at the challenges we face with the preschool to prison pipeline. We understand that the school to prison pipeline operates with such a brutal degree of efficiency, it begins in preschool. That's where we see the beginnings of disparities with respect to discipline. In the state of Florida and other states across the country, the NAACP has worked with the faith community to pass laws and regulations to ensure that we have fewer police officers in school and more teachers and counselors in school. Solid, empirically based advocacy. Last note on voting rights reform. As was noted, the NAACP in the course of 10 months won 9 victories against voter suppression in Texas and in North Carolina with our lawyers. But can I tell you this? It wasn't just our lawyers in the courts, it was also our rabbis in the street. My history tells me that 2 years ago, when we marched from Selma, Alabama to Washington, D.C. over the course of 43 days, 1,002 miles, my history tells me that there are approximately 2,000 Reform rabbis in the country, but 1 out of every 10 marched from Selma to D.C. So if anybody wants to know what we can do, it takes, yes, lawyers in the courts, it takes rabbis on the street, it takes advocacy in the legislature, and when we do that, we win.
This has been so unbelievably insightful. Thank you for your reflections, each of you. I'd like to ask a few questions for each of you to answer. And it starts with just the place, the intersection of faith and justice work. What has been your motivation? Being involved in the faith community, how has it helped shape your social justice voice? And how have you even drawn upon those other voices from other faith communities to inform you? And how is it that it has really impacted your views on racial justice in particular? So any of you that would like to start? This is where we draw straws.
So I'll simply note this, that faith has been incredibly important in my work in terms of social justice. While I am a civil rights lawyer, I've done civil rights litigation, I'm a fourth generation minister in my church. But I will note that, like a great many clergy, I draw from a variety of wells of inspiration. And so when I was a seminary student, I studied with Walter Mueller, who taught Dr. King, but also I studied with Elie Wiesel. I draw upon different wells. And I would simply note this. We are at a moment where if we understand that the divisions in the country can be bridged by our common and shared value, our reservoir of values. Here's what I mean. Values are the lingua franca, if you will, of political discourse, where the D's and R's can't agree, where left coast and right coast and the Midwest and Deep South can't agree. But when we speak as clergy, as lay people, as rabbis, as ministers, and priests, in terms of our humanity, deeply rooted in our theology, people listen. And we see that with respect to the criminal justice system. When we start talking about not the otherized they, but the inclusive us. If we invoke Martin Buber and we start talking about they as thou, people listen to us. We got to claim that language. We got not only have to claim the language, we have to claim the values that inform and speak and make the language intelligible. If not, we find ourselves in these solipsistic cells, unintelligible to one another.
Thank you. Thank you.
I grew up in a probably somewhat typical Reformed Jewish home in Great Neck, New York. I was reading, in thinking about this question, I came across Norman Podhoritz's very intense book entitled Why Are Jews Liberal? And he accused people like me of believing that the tenets of Reform Judaism and of Judaism generally merged somehow with believing in social justice and equality. And I guess I would say that is what I was taught growing up, without even knowing it. From the start, not just people in my family, but people in my community and in the larger community were taught that we had been very blessed and that there was an urgent need to reach out to different communities, to people who were struggling to be part of the greater fights. One of my earliest political memories, I was born in 1960, was the day after Dr. King was assassinated. A group of rabbis and ministers and priests organized the entire community to stand together in the town green. And I think that kind of experience marked me probably far more. I certainly understand now that it marked me much more than I understood when I was younger. The career that I've chosen to use the law as a tool of social justice, I realize also has deep roots in our community. On my wall at the Brennan Center, of course, we've got Justice Brennan's tributes and portrait and memorabilia, but in my office, in addition, I have a picture of Justice Brandeis, who was, of course, the first Jewish justice on the Supreme Court. His confirmation hearing made the Bork hearings and the Gorsuch hearings combined look like nothing. The raw and naked outpouring of anti-Semitism reflected then didn't keep him from going on the court. And he was not only the first Jewish justice, but the first great public interest lawyer in American history, what we would consider somebody using the tools of law to fight for justice. And right before he was nominated, he gave a speech that was very controversial. It was one of the things they held against him at the time. He said in Chicago that he believed it should be a violation, and was a violation of the canon of ethics for lawyers, to lobby for something you don't believe in. Everybody, he said, deserves a lawyer in court, but not everybody deserves a lobbyist. When you're speaking in public, when you're speaking about the law, when you're speaking to the broader national community, you have to do what's right. And you have to fight for what's right. On a good day, I try to live up to that, but I realize too that that comes out of a type of faith community background that gets stronger every day for me.
I am currently presiding over a third interfaith generation. My last name, Kerman, is the name of my Jewish grandfather. I'm married to a Jewish man. He's on his way back from a Jewish conference in Utah right now, and I called him a couple days ago. I was like, "What are you doing?" He's like, "Talking and eating." So an interfaith family and an interfaith community is integral to my own childhood and the childhood I'm giving my own son now. I thought about this question relative to my experience of incarceration, because one of the things that's interesting when you're locked up, when you are confined to a prison or jail, you of course lose almost all of your rights of citizenship, and by law. And you lose, many of your human rights by practice. One of the only rights that is even marginally respected or protected for incarcerated people are rights around worship. That would be my observation of being locked up, is that that's one of the only things that a prisoner can count on. And so, partly because of that, and partly because of the forces of the outside community, people of faith are some of the only people who have been able to, and also been interested in, coming into prisons and jails and doing their work there and interfacing with incarcerated people and helping them navigate and survive that crucible experience. And I've seen people of all faith come into prisons and jails to give comfort, to give education, to provide all kinds of things. And of course, we see that in the men's prison that both you and I now know so well. The transformation of that prison from a very, very bad and dangerous place that was under federal receivership for more than a decade was really sparked by people of faith going into that facility and making it a better place. So I think that there's a crucially important role, which is historic and is one of the only things that we can count on when we think about how those systems of control and how those institutions work. One of the only things that they will open up the door. I always say that a prisoner jail with transparent walls would probably be the best possible prisoner jail, and very few prisons or jails are operated with transparency or an active relationship with the outside community. But that's an important role that people of faith have to do, because those are some of the only folks that a prison warden or whoever controls a system will open up those doors to.
Thank you. I know that so much of our conversation here as a group has been over the past, is it only a day? I think it's only a day. Remarkably, we've covered a lot of territory, but I know that a great concern is that we feel that we have some tools to go back to our communities with. What feels unattainable on a federal level is now forcing us as community leaders and lay leaders to really readjust, recalibrate our thinking. So with that, I'd love to hear some of your reflections on what could help us to really be the most powerful. Any of your bits from your toolkits that you each independently have based on your profession, based on your experience, to help us really do that work that we need to do on state and local levels really effectively.
I would just note that with respect to state advocacy, which is the most viral form of advocacy we have at the moment, is the power of clergy and congregations to convene. I want to note that. I think it's incredibly important that congregations and clergy convene the players, because your congregations represent neutral ground, moral ground, sacred ground. Very powerful. Number two, with respect to messaging, I don't have any studies to back this up, but I just know when I tweet, the Reform rabbis are like all over it, right? I'm just not sure what's happening, but this is like a very social media savvy group. Incredibly important, right? Because the messaging on these criminal justice issues has to be broader, because as long as we're talking about those folks, as opposed to the reality is many of our children and grandchildren are likely to be arrested, likely to get wrapped up in the criminal justice system. That is something that we don't want to acknowledge, but that's an empirical reality. So the messaging needs to be broad, and I believe that the faith community has to be self-conscious about that. Targeting who you want to reach, how you want to reach them on social media and traditional media. Number three, being very focused and disciplined when it comes to a legislative agenda. So in the states, focusing on alternative courts, juvenile youth court, drug courts, veteran courts. That's a way of stopping people from getting into the system in the first place. And it's politically palatable. Four, in terms of sentencing reform, we got to take that on. The fact of the matter, let's just take it on even more vigorously, both in the states and federally. We can't give up there. Because if I can just leave you with this little story. When I finished Yale Law School, I clerked on the Fourth Circuit, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit for the Chief Judge. I spent 1 solid year turning down the appeals of people exactly my age trying to get out from under these draconian drug sentences. So if you can imagine being 26, saying to people 27, 28, your life is over, and there's nothing you can do about it, there's no appeal, and there's nothing the judge can do for you. We have to change that, and we can change that. And again, that's just being focused, disciplined, partnering with the NAACP, ACLU, the Vera Center, Brennan. If we take the research that's available, you translate it into moral terms, organize people, you can get meetings with state legislators, and again, help them to understand it's not a D thing, it's not an R thing, it's a moral thing. And you have the ability to deliver that message.
If you'd like to comment on that, either of you?
I would say a few things. First of all, you are incredible sources of information for people at a moment when there is a hunger not only for social media but for physical in-person interaction. Everybody here can be a connector. Every institution here can be a hub for gatherings, for meeting, for people deciding among themselves what to do. There are a lot of national organizations that can provide information. The Brennan Center sends out we have electronic newsletters. We've actually got a sign-in sheet outside for anybody who would like to receive the information. But you all are the most important conveyors of information and gatherers of information. That's the second point I want to make. We all understandably can turn on our TV when we come home and watch 10 hours of MSNBC and be mesmerized by what's going on nationally. I will find myself saying something I never thought I would say. Washington is dysfunctional and broken. Thank God. We're seeing that as dangerous as some of the trends are, the system pushed by all of us is restoring its own place, and the pressure matters. We saw, for example, when it came to the effort to take away health care from 24 million people, that simply showing up and talking at town halls in a respectful but angry way worked. And so that kind of pressure at the national level works, but that goes to the third point, which is we've all been, in many ways, asleep politically for a long time, but no more so than anywhere than in state and local politics and government. The collapse of traditional newspapers means that most state capitals barely get covered. City halls barely get covered. The politicians in those places feel much less pressure than the people in Washington, believe it or not. They act in the dark. Nobody even knows what they look like. And so I encourage you to think about local agendas and state agendas, and not only being against, but what are you for? Because over and over again, as Cornell Brooks has said, there are victories that can be won in red states and in blue states for reforms for criminal justice, for reforms on voting, of a kind that actually, even while all this crazy partisan fighting is going on in Washington, actually make progress at the same time.
I would quickly say that we have a system that privileges some people's safety and freedom over other people's safety and freedom, quite literally. And most of us in this room enjoy a great deal of safety and a great deal of freedom. And it's so important to think about the people just across town, wherever you live, whose safety and freedom is coming at a cost. And it's incredibly important for mayors, for police chiefs, for sheriffs, for prosecutors, for judges, most of whom are elected in this country, unfortunately. It's not a best practice, to hear from the people who are most fortunate that this is unacceptable. So that, again, that moral authority, that influence that each and every one of you and many of the people in your congregations wield, have, and may wield or may not be wielding currently, is very, very important because, power concedes nothing, right? Yeah, so I think that's important. I will also say, though, as a person who's been incarcerated, many of us in the movement say, nothing about us without us. It is crucial and critical to include formerly incarcerated people, children of incarcerated people, all of the folks who have been most affected by mass incarceration as part of your congregation, as part of your efforts, and to make sure that you don't forget that connection and proximity. So some of you have obviously the sort of the influence or the leadership to bring people along with you. It's scary to go into a correctional facility. And it's also not always easy, right? They don't make it easy. So I encourage you not to ever forget that part, that connection piece and the importance, because these issues and questions will mean so much more. Your own comprehension and effectiveness around these questions will grow and flower and become exponential when you have that proximity to these issues that confront us.
So you have managed, I don't know how it happened, to answer all of the questions that I had. I had about 10 more questions. However, your answers were so potent and covered so much ground and so inspirational. What I'd like to do, and I'm sorry we're not going to have time for Q&A either. However, what I'd like to ask you to do, and I didn't prime you for this, but if you could give us one sentence which can be the mantra that we carry with us into this work, make it good, I know you will, but truly to be able to, in this moment, encapsulate for us so that we picture your torch that we need to carry with us into this brave and very daunting work. Can I start with you, Michael? Since you're making eye contact with me?
All those years in school learning how not to do that with the teacher. and it fails me. I guess I would say, this is not a drill.
Piper?
I would say that we wield more power and have more effect on others as we move through this world than we ever realize or recognize. But when we recognize it more, we make better choices, and we change the world in better ways.
Thank you.
As prophets, we're cold, but we also organize.
It's my better instincts. It goes against my better instincts to end this. However, I want to thank you very, very much. What's mine? Don't ever do, that's your trick. Don't ever do this. Don't ever ask a question you can't answer yourself. I'll quote Dory from Finding Nemo. Just keep swimming.